Time and time again, real-world events send me into the annals of literature in search of perspective or respite. And as Donald Trump begins to mobilize the National Guard into Washington, D.C. in a flagrant abuse of his power, it brought me to Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow and all of his ponderings about power. For in Gravity's Rainbow, Pynchon really wants to unearth the past and the psychotic underbelly of power and its paranoid manifestations. This book is massive, and it is a treasure trove that really anticipates the logic of conspiracy theorists, of fascists. It is a sort of diagnosis of contemporary culture and our reliance on and our abuses of technology and power. And in this lecture, I would really like to provide some of the sort of conceptual overviews of what is Pynchon trying to say about technology and power in Gravity's Rainbow, because this is a book that it's hard, like any of these great encyclopedic novels, to say a lot about it in a very succinct, concise manner, because when people ask me, well, what is the book about? Well, I could begin with the sort of standard plot point of these V2 rockets seem to be linked in their strikes to the erections of one Tyrone Slothrop, and Slothrop engages in a long, convoluted mission to try to figure out the mysterious nature of both his erections and the V2 rocket, and therefore the German war machine and whatnot. But Pynchon is doing so much in this work to really analyze, like I said, the psychotic underbelly of power, of colonialism and imperialism, of the military-industrial complex, of propaganda and ideology. And I think that it is particularly relevant that we heed the warnings that Pynchon is giving us in this book, because really what this book amounts to is both an anti-war novel and an anti-technology novel, in a sense. It challenges our ideas of scientific and technological progress, because in it, he wants to show both the heights and the lows of technology, and in the classic postmodern fashion, wants to superimpose the high and low on the same plane, rather than hierarchizing them and assuming that the high, the transcendent, is what wins out, that in the end, progress, freedom, and democracy prevail. Instead, Pynchon wants to show how both the high and the low are concurrent with each other, that we cannot separate them. And I think in such tumultuous times as these, it's very relevant that we realize that at the time that we're being seduced with the rhetoric of the high, with America first, with saving the economy, with many people seem to be under the illusion that we're somehow cleansing the United States of the dirty immigrants. But of course, just below the surface, and indeed often not below the surface at all, oftentimes very overtly, is being told a genocidal, psychotic, fascistic message of a betrayal of all the values of freedom and democracy, which are supposedly touted as the justification for all of these extreme measures, such as Trump deploying the National Guard to, defeat crime. This is very much in line with the sort of war on drugs mentality of, stepping in and taking the moral high ground to sweep up the dirty laundry. So I think Pynchon does a great job in Gravity's Rainbow, and we're going to get into more depth, discussing the way that this sort of filth of history, the terrible underbelly that allows for all of our progress, is in fact not something that can be left behind, but in fact comes with the progress and entails that the concurrent gesture of progress is demise. Now, as I said, Pynchon is really trying to do a diagnosis of contemporary culture, and this entails going into a lot of different domains and seeing their interlocking mechanisms. So he's going to be looking at the defense industry and seeing how war becomes profitable, and therefore how it becomes advantageous for certain bodies of power to promote war, to treat it as some sort of good thing, and to manipulate and utilize conflict for the advantage of the powerful. He's also going to be looking at the way that this intersects with the economy. Of course, this is going to lead to the military-industrial complex, where the very industry that promotes war causes war. War doesn't become some sort of just inevitable thing, but it becomes something that can be planned, that can be situationally and statistically evaded in ways where really power becomes, and war becomes, as Jean Baudrillard has said, about security and about safety. Now, security and safety are really the words that war uses. It tries to protect, it tries to isolate, it tries to defend, and defense becomes the very means by which offense, by which conflict is incited. It becomes its very exigency. And Pynchon really wants to look at the destructive dynamics of this and see how this is thoroughly political, how it is part and parcel of the exigencies of our technologies, of our ideological strategies that led to the great downfalls of the human spirit in World War II. Because you might look at the title of Gravity's Rainbow and wonder, why is it called Gravity's Rainbow? You don't really get a thorough explanation in Gravity's Rainbow. It's not as if the whole book is trying to explain the title like some books are, and you get to the sort of title line in the book and it all makes sense. But Gravity's Rainbow is describing the parabolic curve of the V2 rocket, because the whole book is sort of centered around the V2 as the paradigmatic case of technology run amok, and not merely as a sort of afterthought of technological progress, but the, again, psychotic underbelly at the very heart of technological progress. Because what Pynchon wants to do is, as we travel through the narrative, we learn about the engineering of the V2 rocket. We learn about all the specific gyros and fins and fuselage design and all the different colors that it comes in, and the payload velocity, and even equations to describe the mechanism that keeps the rocket oriented in the proper direction along its flight path. We also have the equation for when the engine switches off at a certain point and then begins its free fall descent. So we have all of this specific inner workings of the engineering, but we also have the economy that is motivating and allowing for the transport of different parts to create the V2 rocket. We also have the sort of ideological reasons for why the rocket is what it is, because we know that when Hitler was commissioning the V2 rocket, he had a particular plan in mind, which was a terror weapon. The payload capacity of the V2 rocket was hypothetically much greater than what was actually executed when they created the V2 rocket. Its payload capacity was under-engineered on purpose so that it would be less destructive. That way they could continue to bombard London over and over with these V2 rockets in a way that dealt isolated and kind of compacted damage to certain areas that would allow for the continual bombardment of the capital city, because what the Nazis wanted was continual psychological warfare. They wanted war itself to be something minutely planned to enact the most damage against the opponent's psyches. And this entails the fact that, for example, you can't hear the V2 rocket until it hits. And if it hits you, you die before you hear it. And if you hear it hit, that means it has hit somebody else, and you're hearing the after effects of that sonic boom, right? As it has hit, and the sound waves have had their chance to make it to you. So that's a psychological aspect that is very terrifying from the very opening of Gravity's Rainbow. But again, we also have the fact that people are always wary because of this. They're seeing the destruction all around them, and yet the Gravity's Rainbow is more like some sort of phantom that overlooks and really speaks with the machinating hands of power itself. And key for Pynchon is understanding how the V2 rocket is motivated by the suffering of both its makers and the people it is used against. Because, of course, the V2 rocket is made in Mittelbau-Dora and other slave labor camps where Jewish prisoners, who many of whom will go on to be killed in the Holocaust, are used to create the V2 rocket. And I have some pictures for you of this actually happening. Luckily, or maybe not so luckily, being a student at the University of Alabama in Huntsville, and Huntsville being the sort of center of the space industry, and this being the place that von Braun came after Germany, there's a lot of archival data available at UAH that allows me to see all this psychotic underbelly in color photos. And I think that this is something that has always stuck with me precisely because it shows the fact that all of this is hidden just below the surface of war, but also it directly shows the implications of technological progress, because the V2 was undoubtedly a huge move forward in the technology of rocketry and of space travel. If we look at the exigency for the plans of the V2 rocket, it comes in its design from the 1922 Fritz Lang film Die Frau im Mond, The Woman in the Moon. And the design for the rocket used in that film went on to inspire the real rocket design of the V2. And Pynchon was really interested in that because the fiction is not a copy of some enduring reality, but rather reality becomes a sort of effervescent imitation of the psychotic fantasies of this film, right? So our media itself comes to create these things that then go on to haunt us by allowing us to kill each other better. And at the heart of Pynchon's book is a wariness towards technology and those who would claim that it is acting for our benefit. Because as I read Gravity's Rainbow, all I can think is, for all of the progress made by technology, it seems to me that in many ways it is overwhelmingly done away with by the fact that we have found ways to kill each other with 100-fold, 1,000-fold, 1,000,000-fold greater power than we did thousands and thousands of years ago. It used to be that our tools and weapons could kill 5, 10, 20 people at a time. Now they can kill millions with the atom bomb or the hydrogen bomb. This is really indicative for Pynchon of the fact that every creation is simultaneously an act of destruction, and every destruction simultaneously an act of creation. And no creation can be made without the psychotic enabling of destruction and terror that goes on beneath, such as the Jewish slave laborers who are creating the V2 rocket. And this is imitated in the very imagery of Gravity's Rainbow, of this parabolic curve. Because if you look at the Fritz Lang film, Die Frau im Mond, that I just talked about, the plot of that movie is that there is gold on the moon, and the characters are trying to travel to the moon in order to escape the world and get the riches of the beyond. So there's very much a transcendent romantic narrative going on here. It's got the love story and all that, and the classic bad guy that gets destroyed in the end, and it's a happy ending, and this is all great. Pynchon wants to contest this logic because what he sees as happening ideologically is that this romantic gesture gets transmuted onto the technology and gets touted as the success of the technology, that it allows us to go to space, that it allows us to streamline communication, that it allows us to make our wars more efficient. But of course, especially with that last one, making our wars more efficient, wouldn't we just like to not have wars at all? Well, no, the defense industry doesn't even want to consider that, but they do want to consider that they can make war better and that they can profit from it continuing to be better and more efficient. Not there at all, just simply different. So the real underbelly of Gravity's Rainbow is that the transcendence, the lifting up into the sky of the V2 rocket, reaches a certain apex point, and after that, it descends back down to the same surface from which it came to destroy that very surface, just at a different spot. So the very earth becomes alienated from itself. And in Gravity's Rainbow, Pynchon really brings out a sort of animalistic, ritualistic obsession with the powers of the earth and the natural, and pits this against our technology and shows how, of course, we're all sharing the same world. But technology and politics allows us to segment our world into lines, and he talks about this in Mason and Dixon in greater length, the way that this attitude of rationality goes to segment our world in abstractions that have real-world effects. But all this allows us to turn the same surface against itself, to turn the same body of beings sharing the same earth against each other. So Pynchon is giving us, yes, a very pessimistic view of politics and whatnot, but really what he wants to do is show how technology cannot be touted absolutely. Even in the case of medical technology, for example, he wants to show how things like medicine and education are touted as the things of the new world that bring civility to where it used to not be. But, for example, language becomes a tool by which Central Asia is invaded colonially, and language is used as an ideological tool. They're arguing over which script should they use to write the native language. Should they use a Latin script? Should they use a Cyrillic script? Or should they use an Arabic script? And they can't really decide which one of these to use, but they're in Kyrgyzstan and they need to come up with some kind of language written by which to write the Kyrgyz language, and this becomes an ideological battle over education, and education shows itself to be politically motivated. And the same thing with medicine, where the underbelly of medicine is eugenics and race science, which, of course, we're in Nazi Germany. This is one of the most prominent periods of race science being touted as the very apex of science. And of course, many science communicators would rightly point out that they were bastardizing many points about, for example, Darwinist theory. Social Darwinism is a teleological reading of Darwinism that really bastardizes and essentially misreads the implications of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. But nevertheless, the point is that rationality is not so rational. It is not unvalue-laden. Rather, it is political through and through, shot through with our weaponry and the scars left behind by that. And I think that this is really relevant because Pynchon is trying to show that we as humans cannot escape ourselves, and the ideologies or tools that claim to allow us to do so are in fact the most dangerous ones that show us the implications of our actions. Things like the atom bomb and the V2 rocket, and television and social media. I mean, he's of course not talking about television and social media so much, but social media is a perfect example of, in many ways, social media is giving us greater communication than we've ever had, and yet at the same time, its unfettered dynamics gives us the most isolated, communitarian, dogmatic communication that we've ever had, where people can burgeon themselves into really deserts of communication where they just get exactly what they wanted in their feed, and their ideology is fed to them because it's profitable to keep people on the platform and keep them pleased, not informed. So all of this is a way of Pynchon showing that technology as a whole is not our friend. The robots are not our friends. That it's not so simple as that. Pynchon really wants to show a circularity that he continually refers to when he talks about the Ouroboros, the image of the serpent eating its own tail, that this is the image of power itself that Nietzsche is using when he talks of the eternal recurrence of the same. The fact that power itself and the will to power is a circular mechanism, that it does not transcend, but rather it moves contingently through a world that it occupies and recursively interacts with and structures. And Pynchon really wants to show how the attitudes of power circularly structure and enable the continual aberrances and destructive capacities of power. And I think that this is a very telling work that I'm, of course, only scratching the surface of, and I've done other lectures on the work, but I think that it's extremely relevant that as we see these breaches of power, we see them as merely surface level manifestations that people often react to in very paranoid ways. You know, they want to invent some secret Illuminati shadow government that explains why the world is wrong, instead of just looking at the people right in the seats of power like Donald Trump, who are just clearly, overtly destroying the economy, destroying our foreign relations, destroying our immigrant communities, and therefore our economy at home. Instead of responding in this paranoid logic, Pynchon wants to show that really, if we are analyzing these structures of power, we don't need to invent some third body that accounts for technology's aberrances. All we have to do is look at the politically motivating factors of technology itself that enforces its continual spiraling into chaos and destroying us. So that being said, that's it for this lecture. I hope it's been somewhat helpful. I would really encourage you to read Gravity's Rainbow. I think there has not been a more important time to read this book in a very long time, and it always comes back to me and makes me think about the extent to which Pynchon was in many ways a prophet of a time that would come well after him, and yet is still very much traveling in his and his culture's footsteps. You can check out any of my other lectures that I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because books are not cheap, and I appreciate anything that anyone gives. It really means a lot to me and helps motivate me to bring more content. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.